Welcome to this webinar. I'm Julia Gillen from Lancaster University, where I'm a reader in digital literacies and director of the Lancaster Literacy Research Centre in the Department of Linguistics and English Language. I'm talking to you about social media in the early 20th century, postcards belonging to a young female farm worker. First, I'll explain why I research Edwardian postcards. I'll then give an introduction to the early postcard, explaining similarities and differences to today's social media platforms. I'll show it was an exceptionally popular means of communication for a period, known at the time as the picture postcard craze. I then want to turn to a small collection of cards relating to the family of Miss A Parrish, who lived in rural Lincolnshire as a farm worker. I'll give a little background as to what we might expect her life and literacy practices to have been like. We'll look together at the 17 postcards I have in chronological order. I expect you'll form your own ideas, and I'll leave it to you to think of any parallels with your contemporary practices. I'll point out a few features related to the life of Annie Parrish, her family and friends, her literacy practices and skills, picture postcards as networking tools, characteristics of this material multimodal technology, and the economics of the picture postcard business. Then I'll answer any questions if I can, and I hope to learn from your ideas. The Edwardian postcard was the social media platform of its day. Edwardian is the time given to the era of 1901 to 1910, when Edward VII was on the British throne. It was a time of considerable change, especially in technologies and society. It was curtailed by the First World War in 1914, and later looked back on with nostalgia. The postcard you see illustrated here was sent and received within the town of Lockerbie one day. Nessie sent it, knowing that her friend Janet would receive it within a few hours at most. The other side contains only the address, so you can see that this is a combination of an image and a one-sentence message. Hope to see you this evening. Why am I researching Edwardian postcards? Well, I'd say that there's been a neglect of everyday writing of lower social groups in society compared to elites. It makes for comparisons with today's social media, gives me an opportunity to work with volunteers, and fits into Lancaster Literacy Research Centre's programme of research on vernacular literacies. What do I mean by vernacular literacies? Vernacular literacies are essentially not regulated by the formal rules and procedures of dominant social institutions, and which has origins in everyday life, as Barton and Hamilton wrote. People decided for themselves how to write a postcard. As with every platform or technology, there are things you can do with a postcard and things you can't. Compare with Instagram. You see how the writer of the card here uses their own handwriting and has chosen to write on the diagonal upside down. Instagram is obviously totally different in the sense that a post might be disseminated widely instantly, and this card is addressed to a single person. However, postcards were held to be public messages, and of course intervening people, including whoever fetched it off the doormat, and the postman, may have read them, besides the intended recipients. Richard Bauman reminds us, communicative practices are historical and experiential emergence. No communicative technology is immediately, perfectly, transparently accessible to its users from the moment of its availability. When a tool first appears on the scene, people have to figure out what it can do, learn to use it, work at acquiring competence in its use. You can see that the writer of this later World War I card, for example, does not appear to be a confident writer and postcard user. In the Edwardian era, technologies were developing rapidly. People at the time considered they were living in a time of great changes, just as is claimed of the contemporary digital revolution. You can see that in this drawing from Punch, published in 1910, 1900 is shown as the time of the introduction of the first cars, but they were liable to break down, and so the horse is helping out. By 1910, the horse has been retired to the field, and the roads have been improved, but it's now the car that's helping out the remarkable, but broken, aeroplane. There were major changes in the Edwardian era. These included the growth of the middle classes and increased leisure time, increased cheap and efficient travel, increased women's rights, and efficient postal services. An important change was increasing schooling and literacy levels, especially the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which made education compulsory and available to all children. Other important factors were the increasing cheapness of paper products and advances in cheap and fast colour printing. Of course, colour photography had not been invented, but there were techniques for applying colour to cards. The card on the left, however, would have been very expensive to buy at the time, and still is today. From the time of its invention in 1869, the postcard was immediately successful. These pre-printed official cards, where you wrote the address only on one side and your message on the other, sold 76 million in 15 months. Why do you think this dull format, the first postcard, was widely welcomed? Well, you didn't have to write much. Letters had to be long and you were taught how to write them properly in school. Postcards were a vernacular literacy. Pictures changed everything, just as Twitter gained enormously in popularity once you could combine pictures within the same message rather than linking to them elsewhere. The first part Victoria UK postcards, like the ones you see here, came in September 1894. In January 1902, the divided back allowed much more space for the message. The total posting of postcards during the reign of Edward VII was almost 6 billion. A huge factor was convenience as well as rapidity. You could send a card from stations or even on trains. I direct the Edwardian Postcard Project. I haven't been as active on social media as I would have liked recently, owing to other pressures, but here are some of my channels. The main collection of the project consists of 3,000 Edwardian postcards, which have been transcribed and categorised in various ways. I'll now move to consider the card collection of Miss A Parrish. This is a small subset of just 17 cards in the project's main collection of 3,000 cards that have been transcribed. I've arranged these cards in chronological order. This is our first card to Miss A Parrish, who, as we see, lives on a farm in Thedlethorpe St Helens in Lincolnshire. It's from Harrogate, which in the Edwardian era as now is an attractive place to holiday. This card is evidently from a child to his nanny, that is a young woman who looked after him. Who was Miss Parrish and what sort of a life might she have had? Miss A Parrish was born on March 6, 1880, so was 25 at the time of receiving this card. In the 1911 census, so 3 years after receiving it, she was living at what was called Manor Farm, Thedlethorpe, probably the same place as here. She was then living with her widowed father, James, and 2 of her younger siblings, James, the son, named after his father, just 3 years younger than Annie, and their younger sister, Sarah. Earlier census records show that the older James Parrish, the father, and his wife Betsy had a family of 5 altogether, the 1 son and 4 daughters. James was a farm labourer, as were the generation above, so we can see that this was a family rooted in agricultural labouring. Unlike many others in the mid-19th century, the family had not taken the decision to move into cities or towns affected by what became known as the Great Agricultural Depression. Their lives would have been hard. Although only men were usually described as farm labourers, women too would have been involved in whatever work needed doing, although probably more indoors centred than the men, if possible. Here's another card sent on the very same day as the first from that family holidaying that Annie must have been working for. In the 1901 census, Annie had been described as a general servant. What's interesting is that the word domestic had originally been inserted, but then scrubbed out. This could have meant that Annie worked outside, but perhaps the description included looking after a young child of a better-off family. The postcard must have been sent with the expectation that Annie's literacy skills were sufficient to read it, but what might they have been? There is a lot of historical evidence that for many rural children, education, although compulsory since 1870, was fitful and of poor quality. Children were routinely taken out of school to help with agricultural work, and Annie might only have had a few years of schooling. This card is signed from Maggie, who is almost certainly Annie's sister Margaret, 7 years younger. You can see that the image on this postcard is different from the ones we've seen so far, in that it's an artistic production credited to A.H. Cole. Postcard publishing was a highly competitive business, and assets such as a popular artist were important. You can also see that the image is marked copyright. Struggles against piracy were rife. This card is published by Gottschalk, Dreyfus and Davis, a truly international company at this time, with offices in New York and Munich. Later they opened a London office and became known for portrait photographs of celebrities, as well as reproductions of artistic works. The fact that this card is being shared by 2 rural Lincolnshire young women is testament to the huge popularity of postcards and the international networks involved in their production and distribution. Annie Parrish may well have preferred topographic cards to others, since we don't in this small subset collection have any postcards of celebrities, such as actresses. They are prominent in our main collection overall. It was common for people to have a preference of a type of card that their correspondents knew about. Here Annie's cousin has sent a card from Grimsby, but has chosen one that depicts a rural idyll near Plymouth. Unlike later in the century, you could choose from a vast selection of cards, whatever town you were shopping in. The card begins, "I am just sending you a PC. Will I get time to writing?" And at the end, Cousin Mary asks Annie or Sister Sarah to write. This is indicative of something we find constantly in these postcards. Writing means writing a letter. A postcard was an interim, quick communication, a gift of a nice image, combined with a message that meant that the sender was thinking of you. But letters were more significant for longer messages, and of course would have been more private. This certainly shows us that Annie would have been capable of reading and writing letters as well as postcards. I don't know for certain how much literacy education Annie had, but in the 1891 census was shown as being at school, as 3 of her younger siblings, including a 4-year-old. So it's likely she did receive at least 7 years' education and could write competently, like these relatives. They write easily and confidently, and the writing is very legible. The message to Mrs. Parrish, "I arrived safely and think I shall like it," is almost certainly proof that Sister Sarah, at this point 21 years old, had probably moved into a new living job. Postcards enabled all the family members to keep in touch. Even in rural areas, there may well have been 2 deliveries in a day, and far more than that in towns and cities. This is a fascinating card for me, having read in many historical books about the apparently restricted lives of rural agricultural workers. The card is sent from Louth, and might have been an illustration of the most glamorous city in the country, London, without any suggestion it had direct meaning for these young women. But on the contrary, there is mention of another Annie, previously mentioned in another card, being in London, and this is written about almost casually, rather than as if it was an absolutely exceptional event. The suggestion here is that the grand metropolis, with its crowded streets, gradually being taken over by cars rather than horse-drawn vehicles, is not culturally unfamiliar to these women. With this card of Dublin law courts, very unlikely to be familiar to this family, we have further evidence of the breadth of Annie's cultural interests, since undoubtedly this card survived owing to being selected from among a large correspondence to go into a postcard album. We also see proof that Annie wrote letters as well as postcards. This card concerns a basket of a food item and demonstrates the fact that sending fresh food through the post was common in this era. Postmen had to work extremely hard with very long shifts and cope with parcels as well as letters and postcards. In rural areas, they worked with their own horse and cart, which they had to invest in when they obtained a job as a postman and gradually pay back. This card seems to be a complaint that Annie has said she can't join in a planned leisure trip owing to the pressures of work. This is a very plaintive card. It is not often we get a chance to go anywhere together, so please prepare to go. I feel real disappointed. This card is sent to Sarah Parrish, who is living in Chorley. Its reference to Annie's arrival might be referring to Annie Parrish, although we can't be sure. The reference to the hope that Sarah likes the card shows that for some reason it was felt to be desirable. The use of colour was not the only distinction in the time. Many monochrome cards were prized for their use of pattern. Postcards were often used at Christmas or for birthday cards. This is to James Parrish from Sarah, although she does apologise for its quality and promises a present later. Memes such as cute cats and babies are frequent in the project's main collection, although this is the only one in this small parish subset. The postcard has been sent care of a Mrs. Kirkham, a reminder that the Edwardians wrote and received cards when they were travelling away from home. Card 13 was sent, as so many, to change or confirm arrangements. Here Maggie tells Sister Annie she can't come on Sunday as planned. Sunday was usually the only day off for such workers, but this time it's been changed. The card was sent on a Friday in time for an evening post, in total confidence it would be received on the Saturday. This is a card published by the firm of Wrench and is marked printed in Saxony. After leaving Eton at age 17, Evelyn Wrench toured Germany. He found that the postcard industry was far more advanced in Germany than in Britain, with better printing techniques. He persuaded his father to help him set up a business, printing cards in Germany but using mostly British photographers. He used aristocratic and other establishment connections to secure lucrative contracts to sell cards at popular landmarks such as Hampton Court and Kensington Palace. By the time he was 21, he was wealthy and a minor celebrity himself for making such success in the postcard business. But he'd overexpanded and the company went bust, long before this card was bought and sent. I might just add that the postcard failure and becoming bankrupt was no hindrance to his next career, as assisted by his excellent connections in society, including publishing moguls. I'll go through the remaining cards rather quickly. This card mentions lantern lecture and moving picture, indicating that the parish network have familiarity with some of the latest innovative entertainment technologies, such as magic lantern shows and the beginning of cinema. This card, as others, mentions train travel. The rail network was at its zenith in 1909. Its extent is virtually impossible for us to imagine nowadays. The railways catered for virtually everybody. Here we see that Annie Parrish herself was staying in Newmarket, a street in Louth. It was very much a working class street. Although I couldn't find a house called Inglethorpe in the census, I could see that its inhabitants included labourers, a boot repairer, a domestic gardener, laundress, a wheelwright, and many people retired from manual trades, so presumably it was not a wealthy part of town. Still, it does suggest that Annie could spend some time in a town away from the farm. The last card is rather nicely a postcard to wish Annie Parrish a happy birthday. It mentions fashion, the millinery catalogue, and also makes it plain that letters were still being written as well as postcards. I don't have later cards, but did manage to find out a little more about Annie Parrish. She was listed in the 1939 England and Wales Register as living at 95 Roman Bank, Thedlethorpe, in a small household just with her younger brother James. He is listed as a smallholder, and Annie as having been born on March the 6th, 1880, and working as a housekeeper. Whether in their house or still beyond it, I cannot be sure. A contributor to Ancestry.com has added that Annie Parrish died in 1966, but I've been unable to check that information yet. I'm going to end with a quotation that I've used before when writing about Edwardian postcards, but I think it captures the phenomenon so well. In 1907, James Douglas, the London journalist, wrote, "When the archaeologists of the 30th century begin to excavate the ruins of London, they will fasten upon the picture postcards as the best guide to the spirit of the Edwardian era. Like all great inventions, the picture postcard has wrought a silent revolution in our habits. It has secretly delivered us from the toil of letter writing." These are references to works I've drawn upon in this talk. Here is where you can find more information about the future of the project. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Oh, lovely to know that they travelled around, I see. Yes, it's fascinating to see that even the poorest of Edwardians, except of course the underclass without employment, were very able to travel around. The rail system was at its zenith, absolutely at its peak in 1909, with more miles of track than ever before or since. And it's very clear from our postcards that even low earning people did still sometimes have the opportunity to travel around. And that's another parallel with social media. The fact that when they were away, they didn't just send postcards like people might have sent holiday postcards in the 20th century, especially later in the 20th century, they also received them. So just as with social media today, we don't stop using Facebook or Twitter or whatever when we're travelling, the Edwardians didn't stop using postcards when they travelled. I've got another question. Did men write them, or was it a female-dominated media? And indeed, that's one of the questions that I was interested to find out when we started off the project. So we categorised all of the cards, all of the 3,000, as to whether they were male senders, male recipients, female senders, female recipients. And although there were more females than males, there are still a lot of males. It wasn't a huge difference at all. We also looked into different social classes, and to the extent that we can, where we've been able to find people in the census, like Annie Parrish and so forth. And we found that just as the media discourses said at the time, they were popular amongst people of all social classes, virtually. Obviously, I always have to accept the very poorest of the poor with no resources. But people such as Annie, it's clear that postcards were a large part of their lives. Other people in possibly even more challenging conditions, such as a hamlet in Cornwall, a tin miner's daughter, had a couple of postcards that have come down to us. On the other hand, we have a postcard, for example, sent to a daughter of Lloyd George, and there's a lot of information at the time to show that even the aristocracy were using postcards. Yes, somebody has written about the content of the postcards, which also, of course, I'm analysing, and it's very much just as you've said. I'm sorry that the messages don't come across with a name attached to it, but indeed, a lot of them are what have sometimes been called phatic communication, if you like, or just keeping in touch for to keep in touch. When you send a postcard, or rather when you sent a postcard in the Edwardian era, you were sending a picture that you thought the other person might like, with a short message to show that you were thinking of them. But just as Annie's postcards say when they write about letters, if you had something important to write to Annie, you would have put it in a letter. It would have had greater privacy, no chance of the employer or other people reading it. I'll just have a look to see if there's any other questions or comments there? Yes, Ruth says they were probably the first working women who could write well enough to communicate in this way. Revolutionary. Yes, I think two things there to say. Yes, it was revolutionary in some ways. I mean, historians often tell us that a lot of people did learn literacy before the 1870 Education Act, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But nevertheless, if you look across the country into including into these rural communities, I think it's very clear that the 1870 Education Act did have a lot of effects. So therefore, by the time you get to the first decade of the 20th century, you have got an essentially literate population. And yes, it was revolutionary, I believe, the postcard, because it was cheap. It cost half a penny stamp. It's plain that people did value it and could do it. And in fact, there was nothing like it between that period and the digital revolution, because of the fact that there were so many postal deliveries a day. This was perhaps particularly apparent in a town. If you're in a town, for example, there were perhaps up to 6, or believe it or not, even in a very few places, up to 10 deliveries a day. Potentially, a postcard could land on your doormat between 6 AM in the morning and 10 PM at night. So it would have felt as if they could come at any time. And of course, well, I say of course, but once we got to the First World War, that stopped. And so we lost the ability to exchange written messages cheaply until the advent of the digital revolution. And of course, it was quite a while then until we could combine pictures and messages easily. Lauren asked, to what extent have you been able to reconstruct people's social networks from the senders? And I've tried this in a few minor cases. The very first card, you might remember, was sent by Nessie, saying, hope to see you this evening, love, Nessie. And as it happens, I have quite a few cards to that young woman, the young woman recipient of that, Janet Carmichael. And so I did kind of just make a simple geographic system to look and see where her contacts were, and try and reconstruct how she would have developed them. I mean, she was a young woman in a way with an apparently narrow life. Born in Manchester, but moved to Buxton when she was about 3 or 5, and then didn't really move. And yet I could see through her cards that she made friends in other places, partly because her mother sometimes put up lodgers, and partly because, although the mother was a widow, she kept some connections with the father's family. And indeed, that was how I surmise, I don't know this for sure, but it's the same area, Lockerbie, where her father's relatives came from. So I can map, in that particular case, I could map her network and show that it was a bit more extensive. Ruth says that she's surprised at the quality of the colours and how little they've actually changed. Yeah, it's fascinating. Obviously they didn't have colour photography, and there are various means of applying colour to the postcards, including hand painting, in fact, in the Edwardian era. I think how little they've changed, yeah, it's partly a function of the fact that the cards I have to Annie Parrish are, as I mentioned, almost wholly well, of places, or there's that one of a painting, and there's just one of the cute cats. And so what is sort of missing in that subset, which happens a lot, is perhaps drawings of buildings, that kind of thing, and also what we would now call memes, such as the cute cats, cute babies, cute children, also very popular, dressed up dogs, that kind of thing. Then also another meme that was very popular in the Edwardian era was rough seas. So you see a lot of postcards with of coastal scenes, but with very dramatic seas, not necessarily photographed, quite often touched up afterwards, sometimes quite obviously, so kind of an equivalent of Photoshop. Ruth asks, did they regain popularity after World War I? And the answer is no. The Postal Service never recovered to its previous extent. Paper went up, the price of cards went up, the price of postage went up, fewer postmen. And there just seems to be a cultural sense that actually by about 1910, the numbers of postcards sent were beginning to fall. It had been a sort of big craze that then started to decline. So there were definitely material factors that put it to an end with World War I, but it had already started to decline. And that's why I particularly focus on the period 1902 or 1901 to 1910. Are there many real photo postcards in the collection? Do they tend to have a different function to the painted ones? Yes, there are a lot of real photo postcards. At first, when I started the project, I was so interested in writing and so conscious of the fact that I was doing something different in turning them over and looking at the written side, that I was less interested in the images than I've become now. At the beginning, and indeed, I still, when I buy them, I still buy them with reference to the written side, and then look and see, having bought them, find out what's on the picture side later. So there doesn't seem to be a difference in function, though, as far as I can easily tell. What happens, as I said, you would send a postcard to somebody that you thought they would like. So Annie's relatives knew what kind of postcards she'd like. So sometimes you say, hope you'd like this one, or would this one suit your collection? But often that would just be shared knowledge. So you might know, for example, that the other person is particularly keen on postcards of actresses, very, very common. And so you might just send that person postcards of actresses. Right. Are there any questions that I've missed, or are we coming towards the end? Very grateful to the questions. Oh yes, somebody says they often see them in antique shops. There are lots still around, might start buying them. Well, can I just suggest, if you do happen to buy any that are from this period, 1901 to 1910, and if they have been through the post and have a clear postmark and a name and address on, so they've actually been sent to somebody during the Edwardian age, then what you might be kind enough to do is to visit the Edwardian Postcard Project and perhaps upload a scan of your postcard, because that's the stage of the project that I'm moving into. I'm writing a book about the main collection of 3,000 cards, and I'm also moving towards increasing the collection to enable more research, but doing this by collecting donations from other people, not necessarily the cards themselves, but scans of the cards if they're willing to share them. So if you either obviously look in your usual way for the Edwardian Postcard Project, Lancaster University, drop me an email or whatever, and I'd be just delighted to share any details of that. And if you do collect others, I do, it is fascinating. You can see them in antique markets and shops. You can also actually, obviously not under the current conditions, but there are some postcard fairs which are quite fascinating events, and I've written a bit about the circulation of cards in postcard fairs nowadays. Thank you. Oh yeah, somebody alluding to the fact that you can get some fascinating short stories from the postcards, like the one I showed on one of the last slides, which obviously wasn't from Annie Parrish's collection, but the person who says, you know, that they got very wet and broke their chain and on the bike, and they won't come today, it's so wet. And you think, well, was that the end of a romance? But perhaps not, because obviously the person kept that card, or it wouldn't have come down to us. But yes, it's been fascinating reconstructing some of the stories from the cards. Some of them are small stories in Ruth Page's terms, and some are sometimes you get a series and you can piece together more of a narrative over time. Thank you very much, Ruth. Ruth teaches year 6. We write postcards, and following this we'll teach them about the history. Right, well, I've got a short video on YouTube, actually 2. They're not on my channel, but if you Google or look on YouTube, Julia Gillen Edwardian postcards, you'll see some. Yes, and indeed, yes, the postcards began, of course, with the Victorian age. Thank you, Ruth. Well, I'd like to thank everybody very much. I believe that this will go up on YouTube. I apologise for the sound difficulty right at the beginning. Completely my fault. I'll put up my hand. But Gabrielle, are there any references to people writing postcards in literature as a plot device or anything like that? Indeed, there are. There's you know, in the literature of the time, there's a vast amount. In fact, Gabrielle, there's actually a book written by an American author purely on that topic, how postcard writing was treated in, I think, Victorian and later literature. So I can't remember the name of the author offhand, but if you send me an email, I'll gladly look up the title and share it with you. It came out just a couple of years ago, and is very interesting if you're interested in the depiction of postcards in literature. Oh, thank you. Somebody said nice railways, postal system, Education Act link. Yes, yes, I think the postcards actually embody that, really. And it's interesting that in terms of the postal system, the postcards have been to a large extent overlooked. I saw one official history of the post office which made no mention of postcards whatsoever, and so I think possibly it is because it was actually called by a Victorian the letter of the poor. That wasn't actually true, because, as I've said, they spread out among all social classes. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So I think we'll draw this to an end, as it were, and I'll ask Trish to close things. And thank you very much.